Hi, welcome to True Creeps, where the stories are true and the creeps are real. We'll cover stories from grotesque gore to the possibly plausible paranormal, to horrifying history, to tense and terrible true crime, and everything else that goes bump in the night. We're your hosts, Amanda.
And I'm Lindsay, and we want you to join us while we creep.
We cover mature topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to tell you a very interesting story that centers around the abuse of two young boys named Jakub and Ondrej Mauerova. Don't always do a little content advisory, but there is significant child abuse in this episode. So if that's something that you don't feel like you want to hear or can't hear, then this episode might not be for you. Just because there is a lot of talk of abuse. The case takes place in the Czech Republic, and we're actually not going to talk too much about a case overview, which we sometimes do, because it's just so complicated and long, so we're just going to dive right on in. But before we start, I did want to mention that there's a lot of articles that talk about various facts of this case, and many of them include what to me seems like a sensationalized version of the events. Mm-hmm. So as Amanda and I were researching, we really looked for sources that talked about court documents and referenced particular interviews, and not just, oh, here's this thing that happened, without talking about where they learned that information, because it seemed like the sources that did that tended to have the more sensationalized versions.
Yes.
It happened in the early 2000s, and it didn't happen in a place where it was predominantly English that was spoken. So the sources are typically translated as well. Sometimes when we're talking about quotes, if we ever talk about a quote, assume it is translated.
Yes.
To start, we're going to cover a little bit of background about the sisters at the center of the story and their family. So Ladislav and Eliška Mauerova had three daughters: Katerina, their oldest, Gabriela, and Klara, their youngest. The three sisters were pretty close growing up. Katerina and Gabriela were actually a little bit more similar because they were a little bookish, more indoor kids, if you will. The family was all relatively close from all accounts, and we didn't see anything that suggested any history of abuse in the family, which makes what happens all that much more strange. In terms of where they ended up as they grew up, Katerina went to college and studied what we saw described as social childcare, and she ran a daycare after she graduated.
All seems normal.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about Klara. When Klara was just 18, she got pregnant with her first child. The baby's father was Radek Kofal, and the pair had been together for about a year before Klara got pregnant. The couple got married before their first child, Jakub, was born in October of 1997. Eliška and Ladislav were incredibly supportive of Klara. The trio lived with them for the first part of Klara and Radek's marriage. In September of 1999, Ondrej was born. Klara was able to go to college and get a degree in economics, and after she graduated, she began working as a secretary. Gabriela remarked how her sister was a really wonderful mother, and that she hoped that she could have the same relationship with her own future children. So again, everything seemed fine.
That's high praise.
Yeah, that's a very nice thing to say. Neighbors reported that Klara and Radek began arguing loudly in 2003. And by the end of the year, Kofal began divorce proceedings and moved out of the home. Their separation was relatively amicable, and Kofal never questioned Klara as a mother. He stayed involved in his sons' lives, taking them to their sports practices. He took them on outings, as well as provided money for their care. So again, everything seemed fine.
Yeah.
In the early 2000s, Klara began studying education and social childcare. Both Klara and Katerina lived in Brno in the Czech Republic. So now we're going to get into the events that led up to the atrocities. In the summer of 2003, Katerina asked Klara why she wanted to get into social childcare. And Klara told her that she wanted to help children who had been abused or orphaned. Then, in the fall of 2003, Katerina invited Klara to her home and told her something that she had been keeping as a secret. She had taken in a child who was in desperate need of help. Katerina showed Klara the bed where the child slept and her toys. Katerina went on to explain that she had taken in a 13-year-old girl in the request of a secret organization. She explained that the girl was from Norway and that she had been a victim of horrendous sexual abuse throughout her childhood and that she had been sexually trafficked. Horrific.
Horrifying. Completely horrifying.
To make matters even worse, the little girl was dying of leukemia. All around sad.
Yeah.
Katerina impressed upon Klara the importance that she had to keep this a secret because the sex traffickers were looking for this little girl, so you can't tell anyone. She also asked Clara if she could take a test and see if she was a bone marrow match to be a donor for the little girl. After Clara agreed to not tell anyone about the little girl, she was able to meet her. So she was introduced as Vitas, and we couldn't see the way to pronounce that right. I believe it's Vitas or Vitasi.
Mm-hmm.
And the little girl looked sickly. She was extremely skinny. She spoke in a really low voice, and she refused to make eye contact. Her speech was a blend of Czech and Norwegian.
Katarina also explained to Clara that the little girl had what appeared to be what she called mental scarring as a result of the extreme abuse paired with her horrifying medical history, right? Like she had leukemia.
Yeah.
She went on to explain that the little girl was often terrified of strangers because most people she had met in her life had been terrible to her. Fair and reasonable, right?
Yeah, of course.
And when Clara met her, that wasn't the case. She was open to her and she seemed drawn to Clara in a way that Katarina had not seen before. So Katarina remarked at how differently their initial interaction was than other people. So while Clara is getting to know this little girl, she tells her that her name is Anna. And Katarina remarks, this is so unusual because she doesn't tell anybody her name. Because remember earlier that Amanda said that her name was Vitas or Vitasi, but her real name was actually Anna. So she shared that with Clara, which really did feel like she trusted her.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, especially if you're scared that someone's going to come after you. Sharing your name, I'm sure, is even more scary. So when the test results came back that Clara was not a bone match for Anna, she was upset because she wanted to help this little girl. And because, she's suffering. Katarina then suggests that maybe she could take Anna in and that she could come to live with her. And she says, she really took to you and she only has a few years left. The doctors say that she's not going to live past 16 and she deserves a place where she feels safe and comfortable for the rest of her short life. And it really pulls at Clara's heartstrings. But as we mentioned earlier, she has 2 young boys. So she knows how hard it is to be a parent. She's a single parent. Even though Radak is involved, they're not doing it together, right?
Right.
They're not in the same place.
Right. They're taking turns.
Yeah, they're taking turns.
Yeah.
So she's like, it is hard. Raising a kid is hard. And that's on top of a kid that is going to have intensive medical treatments and who has, significant trauma. So she's really reticent to take her in because she wants her to have a place to live that's good and where she's fully cared for. Katarina said that there was a doctor who she had worked with within the organization that we had mentioned earlier, and that it was that doctor that brought Anna into Katarina's care. So that doctor then called Clara, and he reiterated that Clara was the absolute best option for Anna, and that she would do her best there. So it's at that point that Clara is like, you know what? Like, maybe this is one of my purposes in life. I have 2 young boys. I know how to be a parent, and maybe I've been prepared for this. From what we understand, that's where her head gets to, is that she sees this as kind of like a duty that she has to fulfill.
Yes.
And it becomes important to her. Clara does agree to take Anna in. And over time, Clara begins to receive texts and email communications from that doctor. And it doesn't really seem like she was prepared for just exactly what she was getting herself into.
I don't think anyone could.
No one could, right? So in Brno, her neighbors said that they had saw Anna and described her as sickly and pale. And they also noted that she would have to be carried up the stairs to the apartment. She was weak. That's one thing that was required for caring for her. If they left the house, she might need to carry her back up. Taking care of Anna was also very time intensive. She had seizures, and when that happened, she would need to be restrained. The doctor also said that she had hydrocephalus, and that because of that, she needed daily spinal massages. And typically, they would go from the base of her skull down to her tailbone. And sometimes these massages would last up to 8 hours, which makes my hands ache just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But she needed them in order to be as comfortable as she could be. Because again, remember, she's only got a few years to live. Of course, she would want to take care of her to the best of her ability. So he also told Clara that during these massages, Clara should rub Anna's genital area to comfort Anna and to help the 2 bond as mother and daughter.
So fucking weird.
That's pretty weird. That's a bit fucking strange. Anna also seems to want all of Clara's attention. She demanded treats and gifts, and if she didn't get what she wanted, she would throw a very intense and big tantrum. Clara was also extremely concerned that Anna was going to try to kill herself. She said that at one point, Anna threatened to jump out a window while she was holding a knife. And whenever they went someplace, like if they were like waiting for the train, she would like position herself between Anna and the train tracks because she was afraid Anna was going to like throw herself onto the train tracks. Clara has a rigorous caregiving responsibility for her, and she is becoming incredibly sleep deprived. She's existing sometimes on as little as 3 hours of sleep. At this point, she isn't working. She's just taking care of Anna.
Right. So Radek, remember the boy's father, didn't know much about Anna either, or why Clara was taking care of her. He would see her when he was like picking up or dropping off the boys, but he didn't really push Clara to tell him any information or more about like why she was there. He wanted to respect the fact that they were leading separate lives, and that's fair.
Makes sense.
Clara began to act different. She no longer wanted anyone visiting her home. She seemed too busy to talk to her neighbors. She always seemed tired or sad. And one of her friends, Marcella, had 2 boys in the same like age ranges as Clara's boys. And they would often hang out a lot before Anna arrived. One day, they went to a movie, and Marcella noticed that Anna stared at the floor the entire movie, and she wouldn't make eye contact with anyone other than Clara. Marcella asked Clara about this, and Clara said that Anna was autistic and had problems with strangers, like talking to them. Which, like,
okay,
that's fair.
Yeah.
Clara then stopped answering Marcella's calls, and they stopped hanging out altogether. As Anna's demands on Clara ramped up, Jakub and Ondrej started to act out, presumably to get some attention, right? And again, that's fairly normal too.
And so they're under 10 at this point.
Right. So that's, again, pretty standard of like kids fighting for attention in a way, right? Siblings do that too.
Yeah, especially if they're seeing that when she acts out, she gets more attention.
Mm-hmm. And then she gets what she wants.
Mm-hmm.
So Clara mentioned it to the doctor. Remember, Anna's doctor, whoever this is. He says that the boys need an attitude adjustment. He said that if they kept on the path that they were on, these behaviors would follow them into adulthood, and they eventually would end up in prison. Seems a little alarmist.
Yeah, I was like, that seems dramatic.
Yeah. So he suggested that they have a taste of how terrible prison is to help fix their behaviors. Which again, like for that age range, that's insane. For a doctor to say that, well, doctor, I say that in quotes, and then just to suggest like scaring them into being good, I guess. So weird. So his plan was to do just that. He would give them a taste of prison, but it would be at a remote cottage without anyone else around it. So Clara and Katerina took the 3 children to the cottage, and it was about a half hour away, and they met 3 other people when they got there. The other people that were there were Hannah, who worked at the daycare with Katerina, a man named Jan Turek, and a man named Jan Skurla. So 2 Jans.
Mm-hmm.
The boys were immediately locked into dog cages that were there, and they were so small that they could barely move, let alone stand up.
And this is where it really starts to get fucking terrible. The group that is there began treating the boys like animals. They forced them to eat out of dog bowls and use the bathroom inside of the crates. And they also wouldn't clean the crates, so they were forced to exist with their own excrement and urine inside of these crates. They were only taken out of them when they were going to be further abused. And the boys were not allowed to speak to anyone, including each other. Clara would dunk the boys' head underwater, and while their heads were under the water, Katerina would hold their hands behind their back so they couldn't resist. The boys would later say that it would be happening for so long they did think they were going to drown. Like, it wasn't like a dunk. It was like holding their head underwater.
Long time. That's sad.
Yeah. So when they would take them out of the crates, they would put bags over their heads. They weren't always sure who was abusing them, but some of the things they were doing to them. And this is graphic, so if you don't want to hear this, hit skip a few times. But they would burn the boys with cigarettes. They'd scratch them with forks. They beat them with bamboo sticks. They sexually assaulted them. They would just beat them with their fists. They forced them to fight one another. When they were in the crates and outside of the crates, they would have their arms and legs tied behind their backs for prolonged periods of time. They would pour water on them that it was hot enough to be painful, but not enough to scar. During this time, they would also play very loud electronica music and have them memorize vulgar phrases and repeat them. So it was very alarming and overwhelming as well. On multiple occasions, the group made the boys dig shallow graves, and the boys were made to lay down in them, and the group would tell them that they were dead.
Whew. It's a lot of just horrific things, all for these 2 little boys. It's heartbreaking.
Just fucking terrible. I know. And they're little. Like,
and their mom took them there. Like their mom was part of this.
And their mom took them there. And their mom's like doing an active part of this, right? So speaking of, one day, one of the members held Ondrej down while Clara cut off a circular piece of flesh from his buttocks. The group then burned the area that had been cut with their cigarettes. Members of the group then consumed the flesh, then forced Ondrej to eat it as well. And they did this more than once, and they would make the boys eat it. If the boys threw up because of this or any other reason, they would force them to eat the vomit too. The boys often had their mouths taped shut to prevent them from screaming. And yet, Anna still said that the boys were being mean to her. I see this kind of vary between sources, but some people think that the reason that she would do that is because she wanted them to abuse the boys more. Apparently, the group would also pretend to hurt Anna, so the boys didn't think they were the only ones being abused. And we'll talk more about that later. So this all occurred for 8 days, which is both, thankfully that it's not longer, but this is also a lot to endure for 8 days, especially when you weren't abused before then. Sure, your mom was kind of distant and paying more attention to the other kid that randomly showed up, but there was nothing like this going on in their lives. So it went from no abuse to this.
Yes. 8 days is a long time.
8 days of this.
It's a long time, especially for little kids.
Yeah.
8 days is eternity. So the abuse continued, but not to the same degree as it did in the cottage. Jakub returned to school after the summer, but only after he was warned not to tell anyone about what happened and coached to explain any of the marks that people may see. He missed 214 hours of school in the 2006-2007 school year, and he was kept away from any activity where people may notice the marks on his body. Think of swim practice or nature outings, trips to the mountains that border Poland, anything that he would be wearing shorts or something like that where they would see what had happened. Ondrej did not return to school because he supposedly had hearing difficulties. With this diagnosis, Clara got permission in homeschooling him. For the remainder of 2006, Ondrej was chained to a desk in the basement of the daycare center where Hannah and Katerina worked. Hannah would also occasionally beat him for any reason, it seemed. She would get pissed, she would beat him. He was forced to go to the bathroom in a bucket and was only allowed to actually go in the bathroom in the middle of the night. Jan Skarla would sometimes bring him meals, and Jan Turek would take him outside to exercise occasionally.
So during this time where Clara is housing Anna, if you will, she hasn't officially adopted her. There's no legal paperwork because, again, remember, they had saved her from sex trafficking. She's undocumented, and they're we're going to adopt this child to make sure that she can stay safe and so that her life can continue, because it's kind of hard to have an undocumented child, especially once you're into the 2000s, right?
Yes, that's true. So per her adoption papers, Anna was the daughter of 2 drug addicts that Clara and Katerina's grandmother, Antonia, had known of. Antonia would care for Anna during the day, feed her, and buy her clothes because her parents couldn't or wouldn't do so. In 2000, Anna's parents dropped her off at Antonia's, but never came to pick her up. Antonia tried, without success, to find them, and she cared for Anna until she died in 2004. Per the documentation, Clara then took Anna in and began the process of formally adopting her. Anna was undocumented, so the adoption process was pretty difficult. Katerina had a friend named Jakub Potoka who helped people who were navigating the adoption system. He helped Clara navigate the adoption with the court appearances, evaluations by social workers, sequencing Anna's DNA, and testimony under oath of Anna's history from Clara and Katerina's mother, Eliska.
So in October of 2006, Clara dropped out of school due to everything that was going on because she was so busy taking care of Anna and being abusive. So the family then moved to Kurum, which is a relatively small town. It had about 10,000 residents at the time. And there's really just not a lot of stuff in the town other than houses and churches, really. Clara was able to get a lease for an apartment there in 2007. And it was at that point that Ondrej was moved to a room beneath the stairs. During the time at Kurum, the boys, who were separated because, again, Ondrej was stuck in this room, they would both be awoken separately in the middle of the night and told that Anna was going to receive 2 lashings unless they took her punishment for her. Nearly every time they would take the punishment for her. Because again, right, like she was sick.
Oh, that breaks my heart.
So they're like, we don't want her to get punished. We'll take it. Sweet little boys. So when Clara moved her family away from Brno and moved to Curum, she completely cut off the neighbors who she used to know and any of her old friends. And she didn't form any relationships with her new neighbors. Alishka and Ladislav were also cut off from Clara and her children. When they pressed her for an explanation, she said that boys had been exhibiting behavioral problems and that the reason was because they had a fixation on their grandparents. While they didn't agree with that, they wanted to respect that she was their mom and like, that's her decision to make. Clara, who was once very close with Gabriele, cut her out of her life. Radek was also cut off from the boys as well. And as of July of 2006, he didn't see them up close. He was told that he couldn't take the boys out because they were part of an educational program that involved outings on the weekends. So when he would normally take them out, they were busy. If he did see the boys, it was from afar. And he did not see his boys for nearly a year up close. Katerina and Clara were not exceptionally close before Anna. With Anna, they grew very close. And Katerina was actually the only person that Clara saw regularly. So like, we have this terrible fucking shit going on. The boys are being abused. They're being isolated from anybody who could save them. Jakub's trained to not say a fucking word. Ondrej's stuck beneath the stairs, can't really do anything to advocate for himself. So it seems like this impossible situation because no one can see the abuse.
Right, because everyone's cut off.
Mm-hmm.
Well, something changed, and it's a very weird way that it changed.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a local father named Edward, and he was working on setting up his baby monitor for his newborn son on May 7th of 2007. Sometimes baby monitors glitch, and they'll pick up the signal if it's close enough. I was actually very freaked out to buy a baby monitor because of that. Reading the stories of what they pick up.
That's very fair. Yeah.
My goodness. So, totally makes sense. Edward turned on the monitor to test it, and this is what he saw. He saw a little naked boy whose arms were bound. He looked very small. He was about 6 or so, and he was playing with a roll of Scotch tape. Edward could tell that the room was dark and that the room that he was in was very small. He wasn't sure if anything was wrong at first, though, because he wasn't sure if it was real or if the kid was just, playing, like he was playing hide and seek or just doing something silly with tape. Kids do that.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I was a kid, like I would hide in like a little spot and play, right? Like,
yeah.
And if it's tiny enough, like your body is contorted in kind of a strange way. So you kind of like, it might look like you're bound even if you weren't.
Right. So he wasn't sure what he was seeing. But after thinking for a few moments, he's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to record this footage just in case. Edward didn't jump to conclusions, though. So he went on doing normal things. But then a few hours later, about 6 hours later, he checked again and the boy was still in that room. At this point, he's thinking, okay, the boy wouldn't be in a hiding place this long willingly for 6 hours. He also saw the boy eating something off the floor. So that's where he's like, this isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
He decided to record the feed and to call law enforcement. The lead investigator was Miroslav Gregor, and he had some deductions pretty quickly when he was reviewing the footage. He figured the feed was coming from somewhere very close because those baby monitors only have a short range. Law enforcement questioned neighbors who did not admit to having a little boy locked away in a tiny room in their home.
Shocking.
So they asked everyone if they had young boys in the home. So like that makes sense. They wouldn't go, hey, do you have a little boy locked up? They're like, do you have any young boys that live here?
Yeah.
When Clara answered her door, there was very loud music playing throughout her house. Police asked her if there were any young boys in her home. And she said the only child in her home was Anna. Clara went on to say that law enforcement being there would upset Anna and that Anna was ill. They had no reason to assume that she was lying, so they just left.
Also, given Anna's history, it would be very reasonable if like a strange man in the house would upset her, given what we know.
Right. So Edward could hear the police talking to Clara through the feed. And remember, he was recording it. So Edward played Gregor the footage and he could hear the conversation with Clara. Gregor then recognized the music that had been playing loudly in Clara's home. When law enforcement returned to Clara's house, they searched her home. As they searched the ground floor, though, they could hear Anna upstairs screaming. They found a door with a padlock on it, and it appeared to lead to a staircase or a small room. They asked Clara to unlock the door, and she said the padlock had been on that door since she moved in, and that the landlord didn't have a key for it. Law enforcement called the fire department to go open the lock.
Could you imagine a place in your house that has a padlock on it? They're like, can't get into it, I'd be like, I'm just going to get some bolt cutters because I'm not fucking having it. I just couldn't.
And I'm surprised they didn't have bolt cutters. Like, they had to wait for the fire department?
Yeah, that feels weird.
Seems interesting. Yeah. Before the fire department arrived with the tools to cut the lock off, Clara called Katerina, and the two of them plus Anna sat down in front of the door and refused to move. Like, not suspicious at all.
Yeah, that's suspicious as hell. That's just a very bizarre reaction, right? Like, what do you think they're going to do?
Right, and that changed dramatically.
They're going to go, oh, no worries, this is where you're sitting? Like,
right. Well, and that changed dramatically to, oh, we don't know what's there. The landlord has it locked, to now you can't open it. Like, what? Yeah, what were her thoughts?
Yeah.
When Anna came down in front of the door, she crawled on all fours and babbled, then rocked herself. They're just like, we don't know what the fuck's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Clara, Katerina, and Anna were moved from in front of the door, despite their attempts to resist. Anna went so far to kick and scratch the responders. One of the police officers that had moved Anna said that Anna seemed weak, even for a 13-year-old. When they eventually put Anna down, she cried, "Mama, Mama," but not to Clara. Her cries were directed towards Katerina.
Weird. So when they opened the door, the first thing they noticed was the terrible smell. Inside, they found a very small boy who was incredibly pale and was completely naked, sitting in what appeared to be months' worth of excrement, vomit, and urine covering the cement floor. To make matters worse, it was May, so it was the beginning of summer there, so it was very hot. So the smell of the room was even worse. And remember that Edward saw him eating something off that floor, so that's where his food was.
Oh, poor baby.
I know. Clara said that the boy was her son, Ondrej. When they questioned her as to why she was doing this, she told police that they couldn't have possibly understood. They just wouldn't get it. And they tried to question her, but she would not give them any information. She was incredibly upset and just not cooperative at all. Katerina told law enforcement that the little room reminded Ondrej of Harry Potter's room, so he chose to be in that room and that it was his favorite spot to play in. But when law enforcement pressed on why he was tied up and left in the filth, she didn't have any response. So, heartbreakingly, police wanted to take a picture of the crime scene, so they had it for the inevitable case that came next. So they brought a camera over to take a picture of Ondrej. And when he saw the camera, he looked up at it and smiled.
It like breaks my heart.
And disgustingly, like that photo actually eventually came out. And in the photo, he does look shockingly small for his age. At this point, he's not 6 years old, but he does look like he's 6. And he has this like genuine beaming smile, which is just like rips your heart out.
Yeah.
So when police were there, they didn't see Jakub because he was at school.
During the search of the apartment, they found that the camera that had been used to keep watch of Ondrej was higher quality than any of the ones that you could find in standard electronic stores in the Czech Republic. It would have been imported, and that was extremely expensive. It also had the capability to record. When the police searched the property, they found a videotape with over 3 hours of footage of Ondrej, and the tape was labeled Tales from Grandmother's Sheep.
Fucking weird.
So fucking weird. Ondrej was taken away in an ambulance, and the paramedics described his demeanor as not being worse than a little kid who had just fallen off a bike. Very strange.
Mm-hmm.
During their investigation, they also found that between Clara and Katerina, they had at least 3 properties. They each had their own apartments in Brno, and then they had the leased apartment in Kurum. Clara was unemployed when they moved to Kurum, and had worked as a secretary before that. Katerina managed a daycare. With their jobs as they were, they could not afford to rent 3 apartments between the two of them.
It's also interesting, right? Because we're talking about very expensive video equipment.
Yes.
So there's the question of where exactly were they getting this money?
Right.
And I would just point out, why the fuck would you need to maintain video records and record this? I am not saying that they should have done this at all, but it is one thing to be checking to make sure that like he's as okay as one can be in that situation. It's a complete other to keep records of it.
Right, right. So the 3 kids, Anna, Jakub, and Ondrej, were all taken to the children's institution. From here on out, we are not going to discuss things chronologically because there's so many things happening concurrently. It just would be very, very difficult to explain.
I figured this way is the best.
So once Ondrej got to the children's institution, Ondrej's demeanor didn't change from how he was in the ambulance until bedtime. That's when he got terrified and claimed that the photos on the walls were ghosts. He was so scared that the pictures had to be taken down. But that still didn't calm him down. When he finally fell asleep, he had nightmares. And when the nurses tried to comfort him, he shook as he begged, "Just kill me. Please kill me."
He's just a little kid.
Ugh, I can't imagine that coming from a little kid. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I would be like immediately just like bawling, because there's nothing that can prepare you for like hearing a little kid say that.
Mm-hmm. And this wasn't that long ago. That just like my head can't wrap around like
exactly
how horrible this was not that long ago.
Yeah. And I was like, I had never heard of this before we were researching it. And I was like, how the fuck have I not heard of this? So when they were examining Andre, the deliberate physical abuse was evident. There were long scars on both his arms and his back, and there were welts in his groin area and a circular scar on his buttocks. When Jakub was taken to the children's institution, he was pretty distressed and disoriented because he was like in a different place, but he was also incredibly reluctant to talk to them. They found the same scars on him that they found on Andre, and when they asked him about them, he had an answer for everything. He said the scratches were from their pet gerbil, and the welts near his groin were wasp stings that he had gotten from a recent camping trip. Because again, remember, he had been coached.
Yes.
So eventually, Jakub did share that his mother had abused him and his little brother. He said the scratches were from forks, and that the white welts near his groin were from cigarettes being put out on him. And he even went as far to say that his mom didn't smoke. She purchased the cigarettes just for the sole purpose of lighting them and then putting them out on the boys.
Fuck. Fuck this lady.
I know.
Fuck everyone.
Fuck everybody, right? So as time went on, they shared more and more. So like being away from their mother was obviously an incredible thing for them, but the more they were away from their mother, the safer they felt to share more details. So Andre said that when the family first moved to Kurum in December of 2006, he was kept in the bathroom, but then he was put in this under the stairs closet he was found in. He said that he had only been allowed out once, and that was on Christmas Day. And then other than that, he'd been living in that little room all alone in the dark. He ate all of his meals in the darkness, and then he was given a bucket to go to the bathroom in.
My heart hurts. That's horrific.
I know. So Jakub and Andre mentioned that there was an Aunt Nancy, and that she had worked at the daycare center they went to, and that she would walk Jakub to and from school. He said that earlier we mentioned that he was locked in the basement of the daycare school, and that was by his Aunt Nancy, which ended up actually being Hannah Basova. We mentioned her earlier because that's who had him locked down there, and that she would beat him at her whims. But so, again, she was also one of the women at the cottage. When police questioned her, she said she didn't do anything wrong, and when they asked her about locking Andre in a room, she said that it was just a time out space and that he had exaggerated about it. So they're like asking her about chaining him to in the basement of the daycare. And she's like, no, he's just making that up. It's just the timeout space. It wasn't all that much. And they didn't have more information. And they also didn't have any way of proving Andre's story. So they couldn't arrest Hannah at first.
Horrific.
I know.
So one of the caregivers that worked at the institution had some observations as she worked with the boys during their recovery. She noticed that Jakub was unable to perform tasks that a 9-year-old should be capable of. Things like dressing himself after taking a bath, he couldn't do. One day she decided to take Jakub to her apartment for lunch and board games. She realized that he hadn't been taught any table manners. He couldn't eat without being incredibly messy. Unlike Jakub, Andre was not taught to be super guarded or secretive because, he was just imprisoned the whole time. He didn't get to go interact with anyone else. Mm-hmm. He had an intense longing for human contact. Just makes me so sad. These poor baby boys.
I know.
He was so excited, even about just hygiene products. And he said that toothpaste was great and noted how pretty the hairbrush he had been given was. Like, just anything made him happy. And that's because he lived in the dark for so long.
I know. Just so grateful.
Yeah.
This one really fucked us up.
Yeah. So there's a few other things that they told social workers. They told them that there were 2 men that abused them. One of the adults was known to them as Jerome, but they assumed that it was a pseudonym, like Aunt Nancy was actually Hannah. So they're just going by another name, perhaps.
Yeah, it makes sense though, because it makes identifying them a little bit more difficult.
Right. So they showed the boys some pictures of people that may have been part of the group that they suspected, were involved in abusing these boys. And the boys both identified Jan Skarla and Jan Turek. Well, we've mentioned these 2 names before, but we learned a little bit more background on each of them. So Jan Skarla had studied geology at the university. And Jan Turek was a businessman and also ran a shelter to rehabilitate aggressive dogs. Which is really interesting because normally people that help dogs aren't assholes. If you care about an animal, normally you tend to care a little bit more about people too. Both had worked part-time at the daycare. A few days after Jan Turek's involvement was discovered, he was arrested for causing grievous harm. And at this point, it was September 8th of 2008.
During the trial that inevitably happens, there's a lot of discussion about Jan and whether he's an aggressive person or not. We have chosen to not include that today because there is just so fucking much to cover. So we will talk about like more of his involvement and how he's sentenced. But just so you know, like there is a little bit more there. It's just we're not covering it because of time, frankly.
Right. Unfortunately, Hannah and Jan Skurla were not arrested until several months later. The testimony against them had been found insufficient to bring charges against them sooner. But I'm glad like eventually they were. So the boys spoke to childcare workers at the children's institution about Anna. And their love for Anna seemed to be at odds with their love for one another. It seemed really weird, though, because before Anna came into the picture, they were fairly close.
Yeah.
And then it seemed like afterwards, they were like weird with each other. And I thought this was interesting. Ondrej was discharged from the hospital a touch over 2 weeks after he had been found because doctors deemed him healthy enough. Which, like, I would have thought after living in the dark that long, like, it would have taken more before they thought that, I guess. I'm glad he was, but, like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Jakub and Ondrej were relatively cold to one another, and it seemed like they almost didn't trust each other. In their first days being back together, they often fought. And when social workers spoke to the boys about Anna, they said that their love for her was more like worship or adoration. Jakub even told them that Anna had been chosen by God, but refused to talk more about it. It's weird. We mentioned earlier that the boys would even take abuse in order to protect Anna. And some theorize that the purpose of the abuse was to create unflinching protectors for Anna.
Wild. So earlier we had mentioned that Klara had cut out basically everybody from her life, and the boys' lives. So her family was incredibly excited to see the boys during visits at the institution and when they got out. When Ondrej received visits from his father and grandparents and Aunt Gabriella, he was bubbly. He was so excited to see them, and they had given him candy and he would share it with them, which, like, it just feels incredibly sweet because he had been deprived.
Yeah.
But as happy as he was to see them, sometimes both he and Jakub would be upset when the family would come to visit because they had been conditioned to be quiet and to not talk. So they would think that they weren't allowed to do that. So it would cause them to get agitated and upset. And so as good as it was for them to see their family, it was also very upsetting to them. Amanda mentioned earlier that Anna was also in the children's institution. Law enforcement and caretakers weren't 100% sure what was going on with Anna because she would attack anyone who came near her. So they really couldn't do a physical examination of her, and they were hoping to do so after she had kind of acclimated a little bit more. So as she was kind of freaking out, they gave her a pencil and some paper so that she could like draw while she was calming down. And they were pretty shocked by what she drew. She drew/wrote strings of binary code, calculus formulas. She even drew like the cube root of 9, but then 2 tesseract drawings, which is a 4-dimensional cube. And one of them was intact while the other showed what it would look like in 3 dimensions as if it had exploded. I don't even know what the fuck that means.
No.
Wild. And they were like, well, she is autistic. Maybe she's brilliant. We mentioned earlier Jakub Pataka, who had helped with Anna's adoption. He visited Anna at the children's institution, and the caregivers there were, again, having a really hard time with her, and they hoped that maybe a familiar face would help get through to her. He wasn't able to effectively communicate with her, but he did see her throw a tantrum and demand to speak to Klara. And it's just kind of weird because he'll later say, oh, I barely knew her. So it's kind of strange that he would go there to see her. He even said like, oh, like despite the allegations against Katerina and Klara, he still trusted them.
That's weird.
That's fucking suspicious as hell to me.
Yeah, I don't trust it.
I don't trust anything now.
No. So on May 12th of 2007, Anna escaped the institution by climbing out of one of the windows. Jakub and Ondrej both seemed very upset about Anna's disappearance and seemed to both genuinely care about her. Everyone was worried that she was either lost in the woods surrounding the institution and that she was alone, or that someone who was complicit in the abuse had assisted her escape. Either way, not good for a little girl.
Exactly.
The search for Anna was high priority, and they used infrared goggles, canine units, and DNA from items of clothing so that they could try to find her. They swept the entire forest, but couldn't find her, so they began to go door to door to try to find her. When they couldn't find her, they began to suspect that she did not escape on her own. After Anna's disappearance, authorities began to wonder if Patoka had been involved in her escape. Police searched his apartment, but they couldn't find anything that would be related to her escaping. And they couldn't find any DNA matching any of the DNA that they had found at the children's institution. So like on her belongings, her toys, that sort of thing. When he was questioned, Patoka said that he only met Anna once during the adoption process and that he saw no evidence of abuse or deception from them. He went on to say that he still trusted Katerina and Clara, despite details of the abuse of the boys having been made public, which Lindsay just mentioned. Like, he was still kind of on their side, which is very fucking weird when there's concrete proof that they're terrible people.
Yeah. Well, and at first they like didn't get into the details so much about like how the abuse was, but even still, like, even if you aren't explaining like the fucking horrific things that they've done, knowing that he was locked in a room for hours,
right,
is already like something that is fucking up.
Well, and especially if you're an individual that helps with children's adoptions, right? Like,
yes,
you would want to see the best for the kids, and just, you know, being the person that just helped with an adoption and seeing what they did to children, you would think like you would have some feelings about that.
Fuck yeah.
So going back to the search for Anna, as the search continued, a TV station consulted a psychic, and a national tabloid offered a reward of $2,400 for anyone with information. Neither of these efforts, though, assisted in the search. While she was missing, a letter purporting to be from Anna was written to the premier ombudsman. In the letter, she claimed that she ran away from the children's institution because she was worried that Clara was in trouble and wanted to find her. The institution had a strict policy of shielding the children from anything that was going on in the outside world. So like the TV, the news, the radio. So they wouldn't tell them anything like that, nor would they tell them about any court cases. But one of the caregivers who was watching over Anna admitted that she ran to the bathroom while Anna was watching TV. And she said that Anna may have changed the channel while she was gone. The letter went on to say that Ondrej had deserved the treatment that he had received because he had threatened to kill both Anna and Clara. The letter was 10 pages long, and it was perfectly written. No portions were crossed out and rewritten, and there were no grammatical errors, which I can't even do that.
That's fucking weird.
Very suspicious.
Have you been suspicious yet, listener? Are you suspicious?
While it was written to seem like it was drafted by a child, it was written in a manner that was more mature than someone who was only 13 would have written.
It's interesting, like, you could use the vocabulary of someone younger, but when you're thinking of, like, logic and reasoning and explaining things out, there's just some things that are going to be inherently more adult.
Well, and the perfectly written part. Like, you know how many times, even typing, like, you go back, or when I have handwritten notes all over my desk where I'm like, you know, I erase something or cross something out. But 10 pages with no errors. Wild.
Whenever I'm writing a birthday card or something to someone, I always write out what I'm going to say on something else. And then I write incredibly slow as to not fuck it up. But like 10 pages, I would absolutely have a fucking error. Like, you bet you're a bippy I would.
Oh, yeah. The handwriting did match the doodles that Anna had left behind at the institution, but still very bizarre.
How strange.
Another interesting note is that when the writer was referring to themselves, they only used he and him pronouns.
Strange.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it doesn't give anything away. We don't fucking know why. We have no clue why.
Right.
So, when photos of Anna were released to the public, some of the people who were questioned were Katerina's friends and her coworkers. And they noticed something super strange. They said, you know, that actually kind of looks like a woman that we used to work with. And she lived with Katerina. Her name was Barbara Skrylova. She was 32 at the time. Katerina and Barbara had met in college. After college, Katerina hired Barbara to work at the daycare. But the colleagues that were like, maybe that's her, they were like, we actually haven't seen her in years, since like 2005. And before she had kind of like disappeared / quit, she'd lost a bunch of weight. And they knew that she had some illnesses, so they were like, oh, maybe she quit because of the illnesses.
Right.
But they did know that she lost a bunch of weight. She looked substantially different from how they had first met her. And after hearing this, some of the caregivers at the children's institution came forward with some interesting impressions that they had. Many of those who interacted with Anna had left their interactions with a distinct impression that she was older than she claimed to be. They said her gaze was too mature for an adolescent. They also said that she had stretch marks, which was a bit odd for a 13-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
I think the idea of like a mature gaze is interesting. Like, I guess in my head, what I'm imagining is like someone taking in things and like kind of assessing situations differently and like being present in the way an adult is versus a child. Does that make sense?
That does. But also I think of like when I'm speaking to a child and how they look at me and how they're all over the place versus when I talk to you, right? Like we look at each other, we talk with our hands, like the way that we look each other in the eyes versus like when I'm talking to my 8-year-old. And he's just nonsense all over the place.
It's also interesting that they noted this because so many people before now are saying that Anna's not making eye contact with people.
That's true.
Originally, though, they were like, maybe this is all a result of like the fact that she has autism or that she is severely traumatized or her like medical treatments. So like maybe she seems more mature for her age because like she's lived a fucking life, you know, like a really hard fucking life. Or maybe she has stretch marks because of the way that treatment worked with her body or because of something that happened to her.
That's true. And with treatments, like a lot of the time you do lose weight quickly. So that, I mean, that would make sense, I guess, for any age.
Yeah. The caregivers at the children's institution aren't immediately alarmed by these kind of like strange things they notice, but they do bring it up after people are like, hey, that kid really looks like Barbara. So law enforcement asks Katerina, like, hey, is Anna actually Barbara? And she's like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, absolutely not. Clara is also incredibly adamant that Barbara is not Anna. First off, she's like, Katerina told me that Barbara died years ago. They've got completely different mannerisms and they sound different. Like their voices sounded like completely different. And then she's like, Barbara was also a lot heavier than Anna is. So now people are like, is Barbara Anna? Like they're really starting to consider it, which means that they're also starting to question Anna's adoption. And one of the people that they talk to is Bataka again, because again, he helped with the adoption. He goes to visit Anna. It's very strange. But when they had searched his apartment, they didn't find anything linking him to Anna/Barbara. So they were like, I guess he's just another person who was deceived. And they start to wonder if the sisters are just incredibly adept at deceiving people. I would just point out that I cannot find any reason in my brain why two adults would decide to adopt another adult and act like they were a child. To me, it immediately screams that someone doesn't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. The judge who presided over the adoption case was even like, what are you talking about? I was in the courtroom with the like, adopted child for 2.5 hours. They were definitely a child, right? Also, they took a DNA sample. So they have a DNA sample of Anna. So they're like, you know what? We are going to test that sample against the sample that we have from the Children's Institution. And it's not a match. But it is a match to Barbara Skrylova.
Wild.
Fuck, right? Then they start to worry, is there a real Anna somewhere who's being injured like these young boys were, or whose death's been concealed? But then they find out that the DNA was actually from a girl named Maria Scala, and she was actually one of the children who was at the daycare where Hannah and Katerina worked. When she went to go give her DNA, before doing so, her hair was dyed several shades darker, and she had blue eyes, so she had to wear contacts so that her eyes matched Anna's.
How weird for a kid.
She was even coached to act more like Anna and to mimic her mannerisms. Her parents claimed that they had no involvement in the scheme. But I'm just curious, like, what did you think, like, why did you think your kid's hair was dyed? They came home from daycare with darker hair, like, you're not going to notice that?
Yeah, that's bizarre.
And they kind of said, like, oh, the only thing they really would have needed to get Maria, like, to be on board with all this was to tell her it's a game. But, like, even if it's a, like, quote-unquote game to her, she's still going to tell her parents about it. And, like, while kids may sometimes, like, exaggerate stories, if your kid's like, yeah, they dyed my hair, made me wear contacts and had me act like Anna, then took me to a place where someone, like, put a cheek swab in, like, that's a weird thing.
Well, yeah, and could you imagine a kid trying to tell you about someone putting contacts in their eyes? Absolutely not.
We now know that Maria's DNA was used instead of Anna's, and you would think that this might be a red flag. But it wasn't, because Clara was told by Katerina that if they used Anna's actual DNA, then the sex traffickers might be able to find her. During a later communication from Barbara to the media, she specified that the rest of the adoption process, so like when she was in court, when she had psychological evaluations, it was all her. And she said that the experts had actually believed that she was only 11 or 12. They didn't even think she was 13. Earlier during the adoption process, we told you the story of what was on paper, right? But that was at odds at what Katerina had explained to Clara. And the reason for that was because, again, they were trying to get her to be legally adopted so that she had a paper trail and so that this way she was safer. So Clara is thinking like she's forging documents and doing all of this for Anna's best interest. And so when they went to their mother to ask her to lie under oath, she did so because she too thought that she was protecting this little girl. So on June 11th of 2007, Anna Mauerova stops legally existing. And at this point, by the way, Barbara, as Anna, is still missing.
So 2 days later, she shows up at a Czech embassy in Copenhagen, Denmark, to get a new passport.
Okay.
There were 4 men with her when she showed up. All were from Czech. And one we're not really going to talk about very much. There's not a lot of details about his involvement. But the others were Josef Skrla, her father, her lawyer, and the third was a former Czech police officer named Josef Kalinsky. She had been hiding in Copenhagen for about a month. Kalinsky was Barbara's spokesperson to the media, and he told them that while she acted like Anna, it was because, quote, she wanted to be among children, because as a child she felt happy and safe. She wasn't treated as an adult. No one took her seriously. People laughed at her and made fun of her because of her acting like a child. Again, remember, this is a translation of the original statement, so it could be a little skewed, but you get the gist of it. While at the embassy, she slipped between childlike and adult behaviors. Specifically, she clutched a teddy bear and she would beg her father for sweets. Kalinsky gave details about her escape from the institution, but left out details of who had helped her escape, or how she managed to cross through several countries without official documentation or a passport. He said that she hid in the woods, then traveled out of the country via train. There were no charges pending against Barbara, so the embassy could not hold her. She left hair samples and promises of cooperation and continued contact. The media in Czech then received messages from Barbara. She said that she was willing to cooperate with authorities and share details about what had happened. She also explained how Anna came to be. While working with Katerina at the daycare, she took on the persona of children and mimicked their behaviors. As she began to act more like a child than an adult, it strained her position because she was supposed to supervise the kids. However, she felt a disconnect with herself and adulthood, and she turned to Katerina to help her. Katerina, in turn, offered to help Barbara create a new identity. This is so fucking bizarre.
Yeah, you're unhappy with life. Let me help you become a child.
Right.
I would have never thought this was going to take this fucking turn. Like, it was already wild enough with what they did to the boys, but like this element of it is so fucking just strange to me. And it gets weirder.
Yes, it does.
If that's even possible.
It does. So in her communications, she also talked about the DNA switch and Alishka lying for her. And we talked about that a few minutes ago. She gave this information to the press to prove that her age dysphoria was real.
Again, just so incredibly wild that she is building a case that, like, internally she is actually a child, despite having the immaturity of an adult.
In interviews, she sometimes spoke of herself, Barbara, in the third person. When asked whether anyone helped her escape the institution, she didn't share any details. Later, she would say that 2 men assisted her, but not specifically who did. Barbara went on to say that the day that Ondrej was found, he had only been in the closet at most for 2 hours, which there's no fucking way. Speaking of, where he was found, she mentioned that he had received that punishment because Ondrej told Barbara that he was going to kill her and Jakub. Bizarre. She explained that Clara had only put him in the closet to cool down and to make it clear that she would not tolerate any threats in her home. But again, there's so much in that closet that was definitely not 2 hours. Also, the baby monitor, that was 6 hours later. So
she's putting him in the closet to prove that, you can't threaten to hurt people. And yet, she's doing this. That doesn't make any fucking sense.
Mm-hmm. While Barbara was living with Clara and her family as Anna, she was also enrolled as a student at the university in Brno. And interestingly, the photo in the school records was Katerina. Weird. A criminal complaint was brought against Barbara for illegal impersonation. Barbara was also aware that she would likely be charged in relation to being present for the abuse, even though she wasn't the abuser. Czech authorities asked Barbara to return so that they could question her, but she refused. They worked with Interpol to question her, but she didn't show up at the agreed upon time, and then she wouldn't answer their calls. Her attorney then refused to provide her address, and also said that she didn't show up because she believed that the questioning was just a ruse to get her back to the Czech by force. They tried to schedule a video call, but she also didn't show up to that. And then the communication stopped altogether.
So, we're going to bounce around a little bit because we're talking about the investigation and we're talking about what the fuck is going on and why this is happening, right? Because this is all incredibly bizarre, right? Like, we've got this horrific fucking abuse of these boys. We've got Barbara with the story she's telling, but like this grown woman who is, for all intents and purposes, impersonating a child? Like, what the fuck is happening? So, let's talk about some information around this, okay? So, Barbara's father was a man named Josef Skrilla. And if that name sounds familiar, we mentioned him a few minutes ago. He was at the embassy with her. But we also mentioned Jan Skrilla earlier. And that is Joseph's son and Barbara's brother. Now, Josef led a scout troop in the 1990s, and all the members of the purported religious group that we're going to talk about in a minute were part of this troop at some point. And the troop was known as the Morenci, which translates to ant.
Interesting.
Also, as an interesting note, Josef received disability benefit payments for most of his life because he had been injured when he fell down a flight of stairs when he was younger. He supplemented this income with what is described as business dealings that may have been less than legitimate. Some say that he may have been an arms dealer who also traded in international intelligence.
Interesting.
When investigating the group of people that were involved in this, many discuss this as being cult activity because all of those who were involved were at some point part of this troop. And it's believed that through this troop, Josef indoctrinated people into a religious sect. What? We've got a cult now? What the literal fuck? So, Barbara's father, Josef, his cult was an offshoot of the Holy Grail movement. And it's believed that Barbara converted Katerina to this as well. So let's talk a little bit about this particular religious movement because its history, its teachings and history shed a little bit of light as to why people attributed these atrocities to this particular cult and like an offshoot of this cult. So the Holy Grail movement is based off of Oscar Ernst Bernhardt's In the Light of Truth, the Grail Message, which was published in 1926. And the Holy Grail movement centered around Bernhardt, who was a German national who was also known as Abdruschen, which translates to Son of Light or Son of the Holy Spirit. Despite this titling of himself, he didn't want to be the center of this movement, like the center authority in the movement. He also said that in a previous life, he was alive during the time of Moses, and at that time, his name was Parsifal Emmanuel.
Huh. Sound familiar?
Doesn't it sound familiar? It's going to sound more familiar in a second. So, Bernhardt died in 1941. This was like basically like a Messiah cult. This is like there was Messiah aspects, right? That were heavily included in this belief structure. But after he died, that was watered down into what it is today. And by the way, his death was explained by him being, quote, recalled back to heaven by God. And the reasoning was because humans' failure was so much worse than God originally thought and was like, you're not even ready for my son yet.
Come home.
So like he was like, come on back up. They're not ready yet. So today there are over 10,000 members of the Holy Grail movement, and they're all over the world, and their local chapters are called circles from what we could see, and each operates independently. And many people still make pilgrimages to Bernhardt's family estate in Austria to be baptized, including some of the members of Josef's sect. Interesting. And he would go with them when they would go.
Yeah.
So this doesn't sound like it's involved with child abuse, right? Like this doesn't sound that strange.
I mean, it sounds strange, but in a different way.
This sounds odd to me, but it doesn't sound like it could be involved in what we're talking about. But there ends up being an offshoot before Josef's that raises everyone's alarm. So when they hear about this again, they're like, what the fuck now? So let's talk about this previous offshoot. So in 1991, a man named Jan Dvorsky in the Czech Republic claimed that he was now the reincarnated Parsifal Emmanuel and was sent to complete what Bernhardt had not yet finished. He wrote, "The Son of a Man, the Messiah's living word for restoration of mankind." Very clear on what he's talking about, right? While this offshoot didn't have an official name, it was known as the Emmanuelites. So the majority of the Holy Grail movement rejected Dvorsky, but his book sold well. And so he was able to recruit new followers who would write him letters. Now, it gets stranger. Dvorsky moved to northern Italy with his wife, Lucia, and he built a compound that was known as the City. And he did this on the advice of a man named Joseph Klimes. Klimes was a clairvoyant, and Dvorsky trusted him very intensely. Also, Klimes went by Mr. Vidin, a strange alias, but okay. So, per Klimes, the city was the location of the future heavenly kingdom. Klimes predicted that there would be catastrophes throughout the world that would signal the end of the world, and that then people would flock to the city for safety. Some Emmanuelites ended up abandoning their entire lives to move to the city because they wanted to get there before everyone else, right? They were like, we'll get settled before the impending catastrophes. Once inside the city, it wasn't the heavenly place that had kind of been sold to them. Dvorsky had absolute power, and his declarations were completely final. They also had purity tests that could result from expulsion at any time. Klimes would conduct what he claimed to be aura readings and expel anyone who had bad aura. Again, people were uprooting their lives and moving here to be a part of this, and they were incredibly upset when they were expelled. There were at least 10 people who, after being expelled, lived in the mountains surrounding the city, and they starved themselves because they were hoping to be able to die sooner and to be reincarnated into what they believed would be a more pure vessel that would be worthy of the city.
Oh my gosh.
Fucking wild. Now, some people left voluntarily when they realized that the impending catastrophes that Dvorsky had talked about never occurred. Eventually, Dvorsky expelled everyone other than his family. And despite this being a place that was supposed to hold magnitudes, there was never more than 15 people at a time. Throughout its entire course, only 60 people lived there. Dvorsky and his family went into hiding and were never seen again after he and his wife were charged with parental neglect because he didn't send their children to school. And the Emmanuelites were seen as an incredibly dangerous group in the Czech Republic because people were getting up and abandoning their entire lives for this, right? And then essentially trying to kill themselves so that they could gain favor in this cult. Now, this happened just a little over a decade before everything that's happening. So the Holy Grail movement was not keen on having association with another subsect with disastrous implications. So the leader of the Holy Grail movement in the Czech Republic made it clear that Joseph and his followers had separated from the movement over a decade prior because of, quote, unspecified differences in doctrine. So they're being lumped into like this group of, there was a dangerous offshoot before. They're like, okay, it could happen again. But the Holy Grail movement is like, not really. They're not us. They are not us. So although they were no longer formally associated with the Holy Grail movement, law enforcement still believes they could use their understanding of the movement's overall teachings to understand what was happening in this case, which, like, in theory does make some sort of sense.
Mm-hmm.
When people talk about this case, they often are very heavy on the cult leanings. But what's fascinating is that people who were involved are like, there was no religious motivations. But if they're trying to protect the cult, they also wouldn't say that.
Right.
Now, law enforcement, they're like, okay, we're going to use teachings of the cult to figure out like what these people are about, why they're doing things, and to be able to like kind of like get in their heads. And so they're like, you know what? People in this cult typically cooperate fully with one another. And so they're like, therefore, people who are part of the cult likely were all complicit in the abuse because they wanted to cooperate with one another. That seems like such a reach to me because, I mean, you could say that with any group.
Mm-hmm.
Most people want to help their friends.
Yeah.
And people who they're close with. So I don't think that it's a teaching that is unique to the Holy Grail movement. I think it's just that these people were all fucked up. They may have known each other all in the same way. I haven't seen any evidence that suggests to me that it is necessarily cult-like behavior.
Right. So investigators held raids to search other known members of the sect. Their goal was to shed motives on the abuse of the boys and how Barbara posed as Anna. One of the things that they found was a cache of dozens of medical documents. They were all for children that had diagnoses for severe illnesses, mostly different types of cancers. The names of the children matched the real children from the daycare center that Katerina and Hannah worked for. But, bizarrely, the diagnoses were forged. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
Medical experts reviewed the files, and thought that given the knowledge that was present in them, that they likely came from a person without medical expertise. As if an oncologist spoke to someone, and then that person then tried to write the files based off of that conversation. It didn't come from the oncologist, it came like secondhand.
Exactly.
The terminology was off just enough that it highlighted the person's lack of expertise. The documents were similar to those that were provided to prove Anna's backstory. Authorities looked to see if they were committing insurance fraud and saying that they were treating bogus illnesses through the daycare, but saw no evidence of this. So it's just strange that they had fake medical papers for real children. Very bizarre.
Yeah.
The medical documentation confirmed the connection between the sect and Anna. So remember, Barbara, Anna, whatever you want to call her, they still don't know where she is, right? Like she didn't show up to their meetings or their questionings. So law enforcement tried, without success, to get more information from those involved. They didn't feel as though the case was completely investigated until Barbara was apprehended. They wanted to hear her version of the events to see how it lined up with what they had already heard, and also wanted to figure out how much she actually was involved. As they looked for her, they learned that in addition to Denmark, she had also been in Germany and Sweden as well. In early 2008, Barbara resurfaced, but it wasn't where investigators had suspected that she may have been. On January 5th of 2008, Michael Reha was dropping a rental car off that he had rented in Oslo several weeks prior when police came bursting into the car rental office with their weapons drawn. He had been traveling with a 13-year-old boy named Adam, who they believed had been abducted from an orphanage in Oslo weeks ago.
So, let's talk about Adam. Adam was the son of Martin Farner, a Czech playwright. And the Farner family had moved from Czech to Norway because Martin was working for the Nordic Black Theatre in Oslo. And the family consisted of several children other than Adam and Martin's wife, Helena. While they had all gone to Oslo, in September, the rest of the family, other than Adam and Martin, went back to the Czech Republic. Adam was a skinny boy with a shaved head who liked skateboarding. And while he was 13, some of his teachers said that he seemed like he was actually 16 or so. Some wondered whether Adam was sick because he had these ever-present dark circles under his eye. While he was in school, he was enrolled in a Norwegian language class that was a year long, and it was pretty rigorous because it was designed for people who were new to the country. And both his classmates and his teachers were surprised at how well he spoke the language, despite having just begun to learn it. Adam was incredibly sensitive to loud, unexpected sounds. And so if there was a door slamming shut or something like that, he would startle and cry. A psychologist was even brought in to assess him because he began telling his teachers horrifying stories of abuse with substantial detail. He said that his father would abuse him. He also said that his father would rent him out to older men for sex. Adam began drawing disturbing pictures, one of which had a man standing over 7 children, verbally abusing them. In the image he drew, all of the children had blood on their hands.
Scary.
Adam explained that he was the 7th child of Martin and his wife, and that he and his siblings had all been abused and tortured together. So, not surprisingly, Martin was arrested for child abuse, and Adam was then placed in an orphanage. Then, on December 16th of 2007, the orphanage had all of the kids out because they were going on an outing. And while they were there, Adam bolted from the group and he ran directly to a car that had been idling nearby. And once Adam had gotten to the car, it just sped off. Authorities worried that the person in the car was one of the people who was an accomplice to Martin's sex trafficking of Adam, and that even though he had run off voluntarily, from what it seemed, that it was actually an abduction because it was part of that sex trafficking ring.
Right. That makes sense to think.
Mm-hmm.
So, photos of Adam were everywhere as the nationwide search for him continued. Adam was seen 2 days later, 300 miles west of Oslo, in Bergen, with a man who had been holding his hand. They were seen by Natalia Stormark, who worked at the Neptune Hotel. When they spoke to her, they had what she had described as Russian accents. They had come in, asked to use the telephone, but she was suspicious. She could see that they had cell phones, so it was confusing as to why they would need to use the hotel's phone. The lobby of the hotel had some expensive paintings in it, so she suspected that maybe it was part of a con to distract her while they stole the paintings. Although nothing bizarre happened while they were there, she was still uneasy and she called the cops to describe the two, which, like, she is on it.
Right?
As a note, Natalia didn't watch the news or read the newspaper, so she had never seen Adam and didn't know that he was a kidnapped child. When they went to the rental dealership, the employees recognized them immediately and called the police. Law enforcement was relieved to save the young boy, only to find out that he actually was Barbara.
Fuck, man. Who isn't Barbara?
Barbara is everyone. Apparently, she told law enforcement herself about who she was. So, like, all the stuff they were talking about was actually Barbara. She was the little boy.
Yeah, it was Barbara. Barbara was Adam.
I feel like everything goes back to Barbara. Those who had spent months interacting with Adam were completely shocked that Adam was not Adam.
Fair.
Some of the people who he had encountered ended up needing counseling because it was just so upsetting to them. The headmistress of the school that Adam had attended could not reconcile the idea that Barbara was actually Adam in her head. She said that it had been Martin's wife who had brought Adam to the school for enrollment and that Adam didn't have a passport. As documentation, Helena showed her passport that listed Adam as a dependent. And as a note, the real Adam was fine. He just went back to the Czech Republic with the rest of his family when they had left Oslo at the end of the summer. So, like, he's fine. They didn't, like, kill him or anything. He's just away. Adam never had to change his clothes in front of other people or classmates because Helena had requested that he be excused from gym class. So, like, it was elaborate. They thought of a lot.
Yes. So earlier, Amanda mentioned that Barbara was enrolled at a local university, but it was Katarina's photo on file at that university. And there was an impersonation charge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that charge that gets her back to the Czech Republic. So when she shows up in Oslo, there's 2 outstanding warrants for her arrest. So they're able to arrest her. Whereas when she was in Denmark, there weren't any warrants for her arrest yet. So they couldn't hold her.
Right.
So she was extradited to the Czech Republic on January 9th of 2008. And when she got there, she was wearing a beanie, a large overcoat, and she was clutching a teddy bear. Now, let's remember that Barbara, as Adam, actually had Martin arrested due to those stories about child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
He knew her real identity. He just didn't share those details with law enforcement, even though he had been arrested. And the charges against him were dropped once the truth about Barbara came out. He even was fired from his job and he couldn't find work due to his part in the scheme. So he ended up returning to the Czech Republic to be with Helena and his children. And Helena ended up having to withdraw their 3 children from school because the media attention was so intense. Martin gave an interview, but he didn't, explain fucking anything. He was adamant that he did not help Barbara escape the children's institution. So during this interview, he didn't provide details about why she assumed Adam's identity or why he and his wife had chosen to help her. He did say that there were conflicting stories, so he didn't really know what was true. But he did say that he was very sure that Barbara appeared to be afraid of something. When asked whether he was a part of that same cult that the others had been in, he wouldn't give a clear answer. Now, around this same time, Joseph Kalinski also surfaced to give an interview. And as a reminder, he was that former law enforcement officer that was her spokesperson when she went to the embassy in Denmark. Kalinski said that the first time he met Barbara was in Sweden. And then when he met her, he also met her father and Helena and Martin Farner. Kalinski reported that both Martin and Helena had been introduced as family friends. Kalinski was questioned about statements that Barbara's brother, Jan, had made to law enforcement during interrogations. And we had mentioned this before, but what he had told law enforcement was that Barbara was working as an agent for Russia and that he had seen photos of her where she was wearing a fresh disguise and carrying an assault rifle.
How weird.
Exactly. And Kalinski confirmed that this was a lie designed to distract from where Barbara actually was. And he said that he didn't like this plan and he urged the family to cooperate with law enforcement. And he said that the fact that they were so reluctant really didn't sit well with him. He also said that he met other members of the sect, and the more people he met, the more he began to worry about what the group was capable of. They also asked him whether he believed that Jan had sexually abused Barbara, and Kalinski said he did not discount the possibility.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. So they also asked him whether there were any other children that were being abused and whether he was aware of it. And he said that Jakub and Ondrej were the only children being abused and that he was unsure of the extent of the cult's participation in the abuse.
It's so weird that they just pinpointed onto these 2 boys, you know?
It's horrific.
I mean, I'm glad there's not more, I guess, but how weird.
Exactly.
So during the trials later on, Martin and Helena testified. Martin testified that he had known Barbara for a decade from the scout troop. He specified that he had seen her very rarely and even less in the preceding few years. He said that Barbara showed up at his home, which was about an hour and a half from Brno, out of the blue, with 2 men. One of the men was Jan Tessar, who had also been in the troop. Martin described Barbara as appearing terrified and said that she kept fainting. Helena and Martin thought that they were doing something good by helping Barbara because she was clearly afraid. They lived in the home for a bit and then went to Sweden with Helena and the rest of the kids. Martin joined them after 2 weeks. While in Sweden, Josef told Martin that they needed her hidden so the media storm could die down before they returned to Czech. He wasn't part of the original resurfacing, but when there was a bad reaction to Barbara, she was returned to the Farners.
So it's interesting that, like, apparently, like, this is where she goes directly after the hospital and that, like, she's bouncing around.
Right. They had already planned on going to Norway, so they just brought her with them.
Okay.
It's kind of weird. Like, okay, we'll just have this bonus person. Per Martin, it was Barbara's idea to pretend to be Adam. Martin said that he tried to resist her, but her mental health seemed to deteriorate the more he resisted. She even asked the entire family to call her Adam all of the time.
Can you imagine being the real Adam and you're like, I'm sorry, what?
Right? The transformation from Barbara to Adam happened before they traveled to Norway. Then, Barbara said that she didn't like being isolated and needed a social outlet. She insisted that they enroll her in school, and Martin and Helena tried to talk her out of it, but she refused.
Also, like, she's 13. Like, presumably she's going to middle school. She's chosen to go to middle school. Why would anyone choose to go to middle school?
Especially again.
Again.
Yeah. After she was enrolled in school, Helena decided to leave Norway because she was scared of what Barbara was doing to her family, which, like, fair.
Fucking fair.
She saw Barbara's relentless demands for her attention, and she felt herself distancing herself from her own children. So I feel like this, like, would have happened again. Well, if she had bought into all of it, I guess.
Yeah.
Helena took her children back to the Czech Republic because she was afraid that she would become like Clara, which I still don't, like, understand how you can get through to a mother to do that.
I don't either.
Right? Like, but it happens often.
Or anyone.
No, I shouldn't say often, but it happens.
Yeah.
But so weird.
Yeah.
Martin stayed in Norway with her, but he was eventually imprisoned because of the stories she made up.
I mean, just fucking wild. So, Barbara is now in the custody of the Czech Republic, right? And she's with the Brno police. And as we're talking, we're going to talk about her interrogation, then we're going to talk about some of her testimony, and we're going to talk about it together, again, just for ease of storytelling, because it's so back and forth.
Right.
Her attorney was Richard Novak, who originally also represented her brother, and he tried to get her released on bail, but he was unsuccessful because they were like, she's a flight risk, which of all of the people I have ever heard of, I have never seen someone at a higher flight risk than her.
Right.
Because she's just fucking becoming everybody. So they also noted that Barbara's mental state was not well, so she was not immediately interrogated upon her arrest. She was also kept in a separate cell because they, one, wanted to prevent further distress, but they also wanted to keep other prisoners from attacking her. Because typically, if you're somebody who engages in violence against children, you don't do well in prison.
Mm-hmm.
So by mid-January, Barbara was stable enough to be interrogated. When she was interviewed, she no longer had the infantile mannerisms and speech that she had exhibited in Denmark. She was timid and she was quiet, but otherwise she spoke normally for a woman in her 30s. She confessed to creating the persona of Anna and living as her. But she claimed that she too had been a victim of abuse. She said the abuse had been filmed and photographed, that there were scars and marks on her body. Upon the first look at those marks, it seemed like they supported her allegation of abuse. But upon further examination, they noticed some things. First, that some of them were actually just temporary marks, like indentations from a pen. And they realized this because the positions would vary slightly between the examinations and they like matched a pen that was in the room. Also, some of the scars were from a liposuction procedure, and then there were other scars that were from a breast reduction. So after Barbara claimed that she had been abused, Novak stopped representing her brother because it would have been a conflict of interest to represent them both. He was being charged with the abuse. And if she's saying, oh, I'm a victim as well, then he can't, represent both of them. While she was at first very willing to talk to law enforcement, she became less and less cooperative. Eventually, Barbara was forced to undergo a 2-month psychiatric evaluation. So up until Barbara being apprehended and taken back to Czech, Klara was incredibly reticent to believe that Anna was Barbara. Like, they were like, oh, you know, she wrote this letter. She said it was her. And she was like, there's no photos. You can't prove it. Like, she was very adamant that it wasn't her. But once she did find out that Barbara was in fact Anna, she then began to tell her story. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's in response to that Barbara starts to really share her experience and go into more detail.
Mm-hmm. Barbara said that creating the Anna persona was not something that she wanted to do. She said that Katerina and Klara had forced her into becoming Anna after forcing her to consume drugs and subjecting her to physical and psychological abuse. She said that Hannah was the one actually calling the shots and that she had told Barbara that she needed to be gotten rid of because of her bad attitude. Her and bad attitudes.
Right.
Barbara said that she was almost completely dependent on Katerina due to her own epilepsy and psychological problems. She explained that the transformation into Anna began 5 years prior.
Woof.
What's weird is, like, why would Katerina and Klara want this? You know, like, Klara had other kids.
Exactly. Throughout this, there is this, like, ever-present allegation of sexual trafficking. And it's like Barbara leans really heavy into that, where she's like, oh, this is why. But like, it's hard to like wrap your head around, like, why would this like secretary random mom who's like learning social work be like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to starve this lady and sex traffic her like she's a child. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen. I'm just saying it's a wild fucking jump.
Yes. Yes. Especially because, I mean, from what we could see, Klara had a relatively normal life before this.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, like, I mean, people surprise you, I guess, but still weird.
Yeah, fucking wild.
And so, per Barbara, she was starved and was only allowed 1 yogurt per day. Barbara was said that she was continued to be forced to take drugs, including injections, pills, and plant materials. And it was this cocktail of medications that made her mind malleable and compliant to her abuser's demands.
There's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot of things there. As a result of the drug use, she claimed that her recollection was relatively hazy and that she could only remember patches. Barbara claimed that she, too, had been locked up in the basement of the daycare center. She also said her will had been beaten down from the abuse and that the captors forced her to take on new identities. Per Barbara, they would test her on her personas for hours, and if she slipped up, they would beat her more. Once she had been abused so thoroughly that she didn't even understand who she was. They built the Anna persona to take Barbara's place. Before being adopted by Klara, Barbara was allowed to visit her own mother for short bursts of time as Barbara. But then she was told that if she didn't continue to follow instructions, there would be consequences for both Barbara and her mom. Barbara said that what had happened to the boys had happened to her. She admitted to part of the abuse and defended her actions by saying that it was her trying to avoid having punishments inflicted on her. Barbara said that the reason that they had done this is so that they could sell her to, quote, evil men who do ugly things to children. She said that she was often blindfolded and abused by strangers. In one instance, there was a man named Hansen who had raped her. Barbara didn't want her real age discovered, so she escaped the institution with the help of 2 men whose names she claimed not to know. She met with her father briefly before being taken to Denmark. Barbara claimed that Martin had forced her to take on the identity of his son, and while she was in Norway, she was being sexually trafficked.
What a story she's telling. We don't definitively know 100% what happened. And there's no point in which I ever want to be like, this victim is a liar. But there are some things that suggest that perhaps she's a fucking liar.
Yes.
First off, she is supposedly being fed this bewildering cocktail and combination of drugs, but she doesn't have any withdrawal effects from it. If she was being force-fed drugs for years like this, she would have serious withdrawal effects.
Uh-huh. Right.
I can't help but wonder whether one of the reasons why she wanted to shave her head when she became Adam was because there could not be a drug test done.
Interesting. That's smart, yeah.
And so during the trial, the prosecution, they provide evidence of her like psychological state, and their experts are like, she does not have PTSD. And like the horrific things that she's saying she would have endured, her mental state does not match that. The trauma that she has is not matching. Another part that they mention is that during a medical examination, her hymen was intact. But I'm just going to say, like, you can be sexually assaulted and still have your hymen intact. To me, that doesn't prove anything.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot that makes it incredibly difficult to believe Barbara's story, especially the fact that, like, she keeps switching these personas. And when you hear Martin and his wife talk about it, they're like, we didn't want to do this. We pointed out, like, this could be dangerous for our family. There could be repercussions that blow back on us. This isn't us just protecting you. You're now putting us in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't really seem to care.
No.
So let's talk a little bit about Clara's perspective. Clara was incredibly adamant that at no point did she know that Barbara was Anna. When she looked back on her conversation with Katerina in the summer of 2003, when her sister asked her, why do you want to be a social child care worker person thing? She is like, oh, she used that to build a story that she could use to manipulate me with. Like, it's years later and she's like, oh, like, I thought my sister was just talking to me, but this is what she was doing. So remember that she talked to someone who claimed to be a doctor. Law enforcement found that the communications she got were actually from both Katerina and Anna. The weird fucking massages, the like rub her genitals bullshit, like that was from Katerina and Anna.
Fucking weird.
Weird. And Clara's like, I only did this to my boys because I thought that I was helping them. She's like, I trusted this doctor. I trusted what he was saying. I trusted that, like, what we were doing would help them, like, in the long run. Like, it might suck right now, but it'll help them in the long run. She also said that Barbara was part of the abuse, right? And she said that she was the one who held Andre's head under the water. Clara also said that both Barbara and Jakub had beat Andre on multiple occasions. She said that it was Katerina and the doctor that had come up with the plans for what had happened at the cottage, and that while she was complicit, she wasn't the one who, like, dreamed up this nightmare scenario. And she said that she only continued the abuse when they returned because of the doctor and Katerina's insistence. So she's like, I didn't know. And during this, she's also the only person who's showing remorse. During the trials, she's, like, devastated and very upset that, like, she was fooled. But she does not say, oh, I didn't do this, right? She's like, I was misled and manipulated, but I did do this.
It's still bizarre to me, though, for, like, a random doctor to get a hold of you and you're like, yep, I will hang on every word you say.
I think that part of it is because there was somebody who she trusted in her life who brought this in, right? Like, I think that, I mean, I don't know Clara. Who the fuck knows? I mean, clearly something is fucking wrong if you can do this.
Right.
But I would be curious as to whether, if this was a random stranger off the street, if she would have had that same trust, right? Because, like, I feel like if you trust your sister and you know that they're, like, generally a decent person or think they are, and they tell you this, like, you're not going to vet everything they say. You're like, they trust them. I trust them, right? Like, oh, they know this doctor. This is someone they've met. Oh, okay. I trust you. And I think that that's part of it that makes it so fucking, like, again, bizarre.
Yeah. The whole thing is just, ugh.
Fucking awful.
Yeah. So let's talk about Katerina's perspective. Katerina stayed silent as to what happened until it seemed as though Barbara, having manipulated Clara, was widely accepted. She said that she had been caring for Barbara since they were in college and that it was an overwhelming task. She said that Clara came to the apartment in 2005, and that's when she met Barbara after her extreme weight loss. Clara didn't recognize Barbara, and Barbara seemed much younger than she actually was. That's when Katerina had the idea that if Barbara pretended to be a child, they could then have Clara help take care of her. Still a fucking bizarre thing.
My brain would never fucking go there.
No.
I've decided to be a caretaker for my friend. I don't like it. I'm going to trick my sister into thinking that my friend is a dying child?
Katerina then said that both she and Clara spoke to a man who they trusted to create a program to re-educate Jakub and Andre. Which is still, like, I don't understand why taking care of this, like, dying, sick child has anything to do with, like, fucking up the boys. You know, like, why? Why did they have to harm them?
Exactly.
I wonder if it's just because they were becoming skeptical, perhaps. Like, you know, like, a kid would know that that's not another kid.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that they were, though. Like, I think that they were, like, annoyed. right? I think they were like, maybe like, I want our attention. And like, when you look at photos, let me tell you, I am perplexed on how so many people were fooled.
Right. Yes.
Like, she doesn't look like a 13-year-old girl to me.
Agreed. But I wonder if like the more time they spent with her, they were like, oh, this is kind of weird. And maybe that's also why they were like, what the fuck, Mom? This is weird.
Yeah, that could absolutely be it.
So Katerina said that there were no religious ties to the actions that were taken, which again, like maybe there weren't, but you would also defend things, you know?
Mm-hmm.
She also said that Barbara had no part in the re-education program and that her only involvement was when she dunked Ondrej's head and that she only did it so that it wasn't done to her.
Fucking wild.
Weird.
Earlier, we mentioned a lengthy psych eval. The psych eval that she had involved 8 different specialists from the Model University Hospital in Prague, and their findings were presented on one of the final days of the trial. Per the report, they said that Barbara, quote, is deliberately taking on the role of the victim of manipulation, and it is an intentional claim. Her pretension of naivety is also deliberate. They also released a report basically saying that, like, she purposely manipulated Clara. The trials began in April of 2008. And as we mentioned earlier in the episode, the story of what happened, the testimony that we hear in the trial is woven throughout the story we've told. So the information isn't like released at the same time that we're saying. We're like telling you what happened with information from the trial. So we're not going to get into the whole trial. But everyone who was involved and was charged was found guilty. Katerina got 10 years, which is the longest sentence. Clara received 9 years. Hanna and Jan Sklova received 7 years. Jan Turek and Barbara received 5 years. And I will never for the life of me understand how you could do that to children and receive 10 years. Like, this is all like fucking bewildering.
Right.
So it took 4 years for the courts to decide who should have custody of the boys. They didn't know until June of 2011. Roddick was unemployed, so he wasn't given custody. What I find kind of like a little bit heartbreaking about that is that as soon as he found out what happened to his boys, he had an apartment. He had his own apartment, right? And in there he had a room for the boys. He completely redecorated the room. He bought new toys. He painted the walls because he was like, I want them to have a fresh start.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the one who got custody. It was Ilshka and Ladislav who got custody of the boys. And interestingly, part of the boys' therapy when they got older was to learn to forgive. So they eventually began to see their mother when she was in prison.
Ugh.
Which I just like, I'm in therapy. And if my therapist was like, you should like reunite with your mom who did this to you, I'd be like, you should get fucked. I just think that there's some people you don't forgive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe it was just to help them move on, but like having to go see her or like wanting to go see her is bizarre to me.
Yeah. They said that like the first few like visits were rough, but it got easier over time. And I'm like, I mean, okay, but like, I feel like that's more for Clara's benefit than the boys.
Yeah. Well, and even to say like maybe she was just that gullible, but still like, that's fucked. If you could be led to do that to your own child.
Exactly.
Like, no, she's not safe. As Lindsay said, they did not serve much time. All the sentences have been served and everyone has been released from jail. Clara was released in October of 2013 after having served only 5 years of her 9-year sentence.
I'll never understand that. Ever.
She moved in with Gabriella and got a job as a secretary for an employment agency. She was not allowed to live with her sons. I mean, I guess that's good.
Fucking thank God.
Katerina was released in June of 2014, but she didn't resume a relationship with her family upon her release. And there is not much information available as to what everyone else is up to right now. It's just insanely wild to think that they received such short sentences, given what the fuck they did to those poor baby boys.
Fucking right.
I can't imagine. Like, it's just like, don't do it again. Think about it for a couple of years and go on with your life.
There's possession charges in the US that are longer than this.
Yes. Yes.
The whole story is so fucking wild to me. How it happened. The shit with Barbara. Like, my brain doesn't even, like, it just like breaks the thought of it. My brain doesn't understand this. And although there was no hard evidence found of child pornography being a reasoning or motive behind this, it's hard for me to assume that that is not the case. One of the things that we saw as like a theory is the child pornography angle. And they even said that like the fact that when Ondrej saw a camera, he instinctively smiled was a bit strange.
Yes.
Like he had been trained to do it.
That's sad.
Yeah, it's so sad. My mind can't wrap around why anybody would do any of this.
Mm-hmm. And where the money was coming from still.
And where the money was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just surprised it wasn't more focused on.
Right. And I mean, remember, all of this was translated too. So like, perhaps they did go into it and maybe it just wasn't translated, you know?
It could also be that they couldn't figure it out. And like, say there was a cult involvement and that cult was led by a person who traded secrets and was an arms dealer. It is very possible that they will be good at hiding those secrets.
That's true. That's true. So if Barbara pretending to be a child sounds familiar, many people say that the movie The Orphan was based off of this case.
That movie is fucking wild to me.
Right? And you know what is bizarre to me too is I know the documentary came out recently about Natalia Grace and like her whole story. This is still like a concept that happens or that is suspected.
In some of the sources that I don't necessarily believe as much, they talked about like her having actually looked like a child, like being like fucking full on really looking like a child. And I'm like, the photos suggest otherwise. Like the photos suggest that like she was a very good actress. Because I mean, clearly she was a good actress. She was fooling dozens of people.
Yes.
So she was clearly a good actress, but I don't think that necessarily means that she did look like a child. And some people were like, oh, she had like a hormone issue or a thyroid problem or an endocrine problem where it would have caused her to appear significantly younger. And I think that when you look at the photos, that's just, it's not true. And that I think that she was just a bizarrely good actress and decided to use that skill in this way.
Right. Bizarre though. How weird.
Yes. This is one of our longest true crime episodes, is it not?
I think so. If you have any true crime cases that you're interested in and want us to cover, feel free to shoot us a suggestion. You can go to our website or email us or to any of our social medias that you'll hear at the end. Mm-hmm. Additionally, our Podiversary episode is coming up in October. So if you have any spooky stories, weird happenings, strange things, anything that you want to tell us about.
Intuition stories.
Yes, intuition stories.
Spooky places you traveled, strange places people you've encountered. We want to know all of it.
All of it. Yes, head to our website, send us a message. You can either type it all out or record your beautiful voice. We'll help you edit it as well. And send it our way because we'd love to share.
Yes.
And with that, have a great weekend.
Thanks for creeping with us. Thanks for listening, and as always, a special thank you to our patrons who support us via Patreon.
Please see the link in our show notes to learn more about how you, yes you, can begin to haunt the dump, guard vortexes, or even become a scorching Sasquatch.
Ooh. Also in our show notes, you can find the link to our website, more information on our sources, our social media handles, and our merch store.
We'd love for you to keep creeping with us. So if you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the show with your fellow creeps and or ghosts.
I beg of you.